My name is Diana Thompson, and if you had met me 2 years ago, you might have called me ordinary, a 60-year-old woman, newly divorced, recently laid off, wondering what on earth to do with the rest of her life. But on the night of my daughter's wedding, in a ballroom glowing with chandeliers and filled with 200 guests, I learned just how cruel laughter can be. When the very child I raised chose to mock me in front of everyone I had helped pay to gather. What she and the entire room didn't realize was that the woman they were laughing at wasn't a delusional dreamer clinging to a late-life crisis. She was someone who had quietly built an empire, one acquisition at a time. And on that night, when the truth came out, the air itself seemed to change. Picture a ballroom glowing under crystal chandeliers, the kind of wedding venue most families only dream of. 200 guests filled the space, dressed in gowns and tuxedos, glasses clinking as servers glided by with champagne. It should have been one of the proudest moments of my life. Watching my daughter Rachel walk down the aisle in a white gown that shimmered like starlight, promising forever to the man she loved. I had spent months helping to make this day possible, both financially and emotionally, believing that every dollar and every ounce of effort was a gift of love from a mother to her child. But pride can turn to humiliation in an instant. When Rachel stood at the microphone for her reception speech, I expected a moment of warmth. Perhaps a few words of gratitude, maybe even a nod to the sacrifices that had made this sparkling night possible. Instead, she smiled at the crowd with the confidence of a performer and announced she wanted to say something about her mom. The room leaned in, expecting tenderness. What came next was a dagger wrapped in laughter. "My mom," Rachel said, pausing for effect, "is going through what I guess you'd call a late-life crisis." Laughter rippled through the hall. I felt my breath catch, though I kept a smile glued to my face. She continued, her voice dripping with mockery. "At 60, she's decided she wants to build an empire." She raised her fingers in sarcastic air quotes, sending the audience into louder laughter. "We keep telling her she should act her age, but she won't listen." The sound of 200 people laughing at me, my family, her in-laws, complete strangers, was like standing in a storm of glass shards. Each chuckle sliced at my pride. I sat frozen at my table, my hands clenched in my lap, my heart pounding against my ribs. Outside, I smiled. Inside, I was crumbling. What no one in that room knew, not my daughter, not her new husband, not the colleagues from his prestigious tech company, was that the story they were mocking wasn't fiction. It wasn't a silly dream I clung to out of desperation. It was real, solid, and powerful. But in that moment, I was the crazy old lady who refused to fade quietly into the background of middle age. I watched Rachel's face as she laughed with her guests. She wasn't embarrassed for me. She wasn't trying to rein it in. She was proud of the performance, proud of reducing her mother to a punchline in front of a crowd. That betrayal stung more than the laughter itself. Humiliation is never just about one moment. It carries with it the weight of years, of every time you were dismissed, every time your voice was talked over, every time society whispered that your expiration date had passed. That night, under chandeliers and applause, I felt the weight of an entire culture pressing down on me. Because in America, we revere youth and dismiss age, especially when it belongs to women. Studies show that women over 50 face some of the highest barriers to reemployment and entrepreneurship. Corporate doors close, venture funding dries up, and even family members roll their eyes when we dare to dream. I was living proof of that bias. My own daughter, the person I had raised, fed, clothed, and supported, had chosen to showcase me as a cautionary tale rather than a role model. And yet, in the shadows of that glittering ballroom, something else was stirring. While 200 people laughed at the idea of a 60-year-old woman building something of her own, one man at table 6 nearly choked on his champagne. His name was Robert Anderson, my new son-in-law's boss, and he recognized me in a way no one else did. He knew the name D. Thompson. And in about 30 seconds, the laughter in that room would transform into silence so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. But before I tell you how a night of mockery became the most satisfying moment of vindication in my life, you need to understand how it all began. To do that, we have to go back 2 years, back to the day I lost everything and chose to build it all again from scratch. 2 years earlier, the morning light in my small apartment felt like an interrogation lamp. Every object seemed to question me. The stack of old performance reviews I couldn't throw away, the coffee mug with a hairline crack, the printout of my severance package folded and unfolded so many times, the creases looked like scars. I had been Diana Thompson, office manager of 3 decades, the woman who knew where every contract lived, which supplier would stall, which executive would flinch when numbers got tight. And then, with one innocuous email about organizational redesign, I was an extra chair in a room with no space. They called it restructuring. I called it what it was, a polite usher to the exit, the kind that targets people with silver at the temples and salaries that hint at loyalty. After the meeting, I walked home rather than fight for a seat on the train. The city had a way of swallowing the newly obsolete without chewing. My reflection in a storefront window looked like a rumor about someone I used to be. I tried to name what hurt most: pride, fear, rage, and landed on something simpler: silence. It's not the layoff that unravels you. It's the quiet afterward, where the phone doesn't ring and the calendar forgets your name. Divorce had come a year before that. My ex-husband discovered the kind of happiness you can measure in birthday candles, 15 fewer than mine. I don't begrudge anyone their joy, but I did resent the narrative that sprang up around me like weeds, that I was entering the stage of life where you curate memories instead of making decisions, where you decline into gentleness and don't bother people with plans. Maybe you could volunteer, a well-meaning friend suggested, as if my competence had expired and needed a soft landing. Here's the thing about turning 60 in America. The world hands you 2 scripts. In one, you become sweet and small and grateful for whatever crumbs of relevance fall your way. In the other, you become invisible altogether. I had no intention of acting in either production. I was through being someone's cautionary tale. Experience is a strange asset, massive, but illiquid. You can't wave it like a flag. Yet it can bulldoze obstacles if you can convert it to motion. I started with a legal pad and a pen, the way I've started every serious idea in my life. I wrote the names of 5 small businesses I knew from my office years, vendors I'd negotiated with, local firms I'd shepherded through audits. Under each name, I listed their inefficiencies like symptoms on a chart: redundant workflows, poor inventory controls, onboarding chaos. Diagnosis came naturally. It always had. What was different now was that I could prescribe. I opened a new bank account with the last check my old company would ever write to me. I registered a name, DT Enterprises, because it sounded faceless, sturdy, and bigger than the cramped kitchen where I filled out the forms. I built a 1-page website in a weekend. I typed the first pitch email on a Sunday night and pressed send with the cautious faith of a person stepping onto ice. On Monday morning, one reply arrived. "We might be interested. Can you come in Thursday?" I stared at the screen like it was a buoy in open water. In the quiet hours, I did research. Numbers became armor. The Kauffman Foundation had a line I loved. Americans aged 55 to 64 start businesses at the highest rate of any age group. Other data told a colder truth. Women over 50 face steeper reemployment cliffs and receive a fraction of venture funding. The contradiction burned me awake at 2 a.m. A surplus of grit, a deficit of trust. Fine. If the world wouldn't fund me, I'd fund myself. If doors wouldn't swing, I'd learn the hinges. My first client was a family-owned distribution company drowning in paperwork. I sat at a folding table with binders piled like sandbags and asked the questions I knew how to ask. Who touches this first? Why does this pass through 4 hands? What happens when Carol takes a sick day? By the 3rd week, we'd mapped a process that cut cycle time by 22%. That number matters because it was the first time my worth crystallized in a metric no one could condescend away. They paid my invoice early. The owner shook my hand like I'd bailed him out of a flood. The second client came from a referral. The third came from a cold email answered by a tired CFO who confessed, "I'm out of bandwidth. Can you be my bandwidth?" I didn't promise miracles. I promised checklists, dashboards, and relentless follow-through. It turns out companies will pay handsomely for those 3 things delivered on time and without drama. I worked alone at first, then quietly assembled a bench, 2 sharp contract analysts, a part-time controller with a gift for untangling payroll snarls, a tech-savvy grad who could make an API handshake like diplomacy. I never broadcasted the hires. Let the deliverables do the talking. I kept my life modest on purpose. I drove the old Honda because it still started. I stayed in my apartment because it still felt like mine. The absence of flash made room for torque. Every spare dollar went back into the business, legal counsel to review deals, better software, a research service that put industry intelligence at my fingertips before my clients had even heard the rumor. The point wasn't to look successful. The point was to become undeniable. My family, meanwhile, curated a kinder narrative for me. "Mom's keeping busy," Rachel told a friend on the phone when she thought I couldn't hear. "She's doing some consulting," my sister said at Thanksgiving, as if she were explaining a new recipe I might abandon next month. Jake, my future son-in-law, tried to explain EBITDA to me once over ham and green beans, and I let him, the way you let a child show you how to tie your shoes. If condescension could power a city, we'd never pay an electric bill. The first acquisition surprised even me. I had been cleaning up the operations of a mid-sized software firm. Good product, clumsy spine, when the owner muttered he was exhausted. If someone made me a fair offer, I'd take it tomorrow, he said, half joking, half drowning. I went home, stared at my spreadsheets, and felt a door unlatch in my head. Acquisition wasn't a mountain reserved for other people. It was a staircase if you could see the steps. Valuation discipline, financing strategy, integration plan. I knew the guts. What I didn't know, I could learn. I assembled a modest investor syndicate out of relationships I'd kept warm for years. Former colleagues who trusted my nose for risk. A retired attorney with a quiet appetite for yield. A small family office that liked boring businesses disguised as complicated ones. I put my own money in, more than was comfortable, because conviction without exposure is just commentary. We closed in 90 days. Day 91, I walked the floor, shook the hands of people whose livelihood I had just promised to safeguard, and got back to work. Success didn't arrive with a trumpet. It arrived with servers running smoother, customer tickets resolving faster, a warehouse that didn't misplace pallets like socks in a dryer. That first deal begat a second in an adjacent niche, and then a third, each one chosen not for glamour, but for fit. In 18 months, I had stitched together 6 companies with a common logic. Underestimated assets that could compound under steady hands. Somewhere in there, the dollar figures shocked even me. Somewhere in there, it occurred to me that my daughter still believed I was between jobs. I kept my mouth shut at family dinners. Not coy, protective. You learn in business that not every room deserves the truth at the same time. Rachel was planning a wedding then, wrestling seating charts and florist invoices like demons. She asked me not to embarrass her in front of Jake's colleagues by going on about my little projects. I said I wouldn't. That was true. I had no intention of going on about anything. I had every intention of listening to toast after toast and being the kind of mother who pays the bill without sending a memo. The night before the wedding, I stood at my kitchen counter and ironed a silk dress I'd bought on sale. I pressed the hem the way my mother taught me, moving slow so I wouldn't scorch the fabric or rush the creases into odd places. The apartment was quiet, except for the hiss of steam and the clock nudging me toward sleep. I poured a glass of water, raised it to nothing and no one, and made a private vow. I would not upstage my daughter. I would not correct anyone's assumptions. My restraint would be my gift. Some truths can wait. Some truths, I told myself, never need to be said aloud. The next day, under the chandeliers, I learned how fragile and how fierce a vow can be. Restraint is noble until it becomes complicity. It's love until it starts to taste like erasure. And love, I reminded myself as the laughter rolled over me like weather, is not the same thing as disappearing. In a ballroom full of people who thought I needed permission to dream, I remembered why I began. Not to be applauded, not to be forgiven, but to build something that could stand without anyone's blessing. 2 years is a long time to be underestimated. It's also just long enough to learn exactly who you are. The woman they called delusional had become, quietly, the kind of person who signs both sides of a paycheck. And as Rachel's laughter floated under cut crystal and gold leaf, one man at table 6 was about to realize it. What happened next would turn the air itself into proof. In the months that followed, what began as a fragile experiment hardened into a machine with its own heartbeat. I called it DT Enterprises, not because I wanted the world to know my initials, but because anonymity can be a strategy. Let the work speak first. Let the names surface later. I stayed small on purpose, a ghost in plain sight, while the companies I acquired carried their own banners. 6 of them, in just a year and a half, each one rescued, reshaped, and rethreaded into a fabric that could stretch across industries. By outward appearances, I was still Diana Thompson, divorced 60-something, living in a modest apartment with the same Honda Civic that rattled over speed bumps. To neighbors, I was the woman who hauled groceries up 2 flights of stairs and waved politely on laundry day. To my family, I was the eccentric mother dabbling in consulting projects, the relative who wouldn't just age gracefully, who insisted on acting young when the polite thing would have been to settle. The irony was heavy. The more successful I became, the less believable my story sounded to them. I would mention a new contract over dinner, and Rachel would roll her eyes like I had announced I'd joined a pyramid scheme. Jake, her fiancé, would pat my shoulder with the smugness of someone who thought balance sheets were bedtime stories. "Have you considered getting a normal job?" he asked once, as if stability were nobler than scale. My sister would suggest that I was chasing illusions, missing my chance for something steady. They didn't know, couldn't know, that my illusions were producing more revenue than any W-2 salary I'd ever seen. The disconnect hurt, but it also clarified. I learned a truth most entrepreneurs keep private. Success without recognition can feel lonelier than failure with sympathy. There's a weight in carrying victories no one claps for. And yet, I endured their dismissals with silence, because proving them wrong wasn't my goal. Building something real was. Rachel's wedding approached like a lighthouse on the horizon, bright, immovable, casting beams across every corner of my days. She was 32, radiant, and consumed with details. Floral arrangements, calligraphy, the endless war over seating charts. She asked me for money, and I gave it. Quietly, without protest, without hinting that the funds weren't scraps from a divorce settlement, but profits from a growing empire. She asked me not to mention my business to Jake's colleagues, because it might sound embarrassing, and I agreed. Love makes silence easy, at least for a while. I remember the rehearsal dinner the night before, her hand slipping into mine as she whispered, "Just blend in tomorrow, Mom. Jake's boss will be there, and all his work people. Serious business folks. Please don't talk about your little projects." I nodded, swallowing the bitter taste of the phrase, little projects. She didn't mean cruelty. She meant control, the kind that comes from fear of judgment. But it was still a daughter instructing her mother to stay small. I wore a navy dress the next day, elegant but unflashy. I avoided sequins, avoided scarlet, avoided anything that might shift a camera lens away from the bride. I wanted the spotlight on her, not me. During cocktail hour, I hovered at the edge of conversations, nodding politely, listening as Jake's colleagues dissected mergers and market shifts. My mind flickered with insight. I could have added, corrected, even led the discussions, but I kept my mouth shut. I was introduced simply as the bride's mother, and I smiled, playing my role. It struck me, standing there with a glass of water sweating in my hand, how invisible experience becomes when people decide you've aged out of relevance. I had lived through recessions, navigated compliance storms, restructured divisions. Yet to them, I was background noise, an accessory to the wedding. They assumed my silence meant ignorance, when in truth it was restraint. The speeches came later, one by one, like waves that seemed harmless until they broke too hard. Rachel's maid of honor began sweetly, reminiscing about their friendship. Then she pivoted. We have to mention Rachel's mom, who's been quite the character lately. The room chuckled. My stomach tightened. Diana's going through what I guess you'd call a late-life crisis. At 60, she decided she wants to build an empire. Finger quotes. Laughter. More laughter when she added, at least she's keeping busy instead of just gardening like normal moms her age. The words weren't daggers, they were paper cuts. But enough paper cuts will bleed you dry. I kept my face neutral, nodding, while inside I was shrinking inch by inch under 200 pairs of amused eyes. Then Rachel stood, smiling into the microphone. I thought, maybe this is the moment she'll soften it, balance the ridicule with a compliment. But no. She doubled down. Yes, my mom's been on an adventure. She thinks she's building a business empire, but we keep telling her some dreams have expiration dates. At 60 plus, maybe it's time to be realistic. The room erupted. People slapped tables, wiping tears of laughter from their eyes. Even Jake's boss, Robert Anderson, shook his head with an indulgent grin. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my so-called delusion had just bought 6 companies. That my hobby was paying for half the wedding they were celebrating. That my crisis had turned into a portfolio worth more than most of their lifetime earnings. But the deepest cut wasn't the ignorance. It was my daughter's face, bright, amused, complicit in my humiliation. She wasn't uncomfortable. She wasn't regretful. She was proud of her performance, proud of the crowd roaring at her mother's expense. That was the moment something in me cracked. I excused myself, slipping into the restroom to sit in a stall and breathe. Tears threatened but didn't fall. I had promised myself I wouldn't ruin her day, no matter what. Still, the irony pressed down like weight. While she feared I'd embarrass her with tales of fake business dreams, she had no idea that the man she'd just married worked for one of my companies. That half the colleagues smirking at me owed their paychecks to my signature. It was almost poetic, almost cruel. When I returned to the ballroom, I overheard Rachel near the bar, whispering to a bridesmaid. Poor Mom. She's been so lost since the divorce. This business thing is just her way of feeling important again. We don't have the heart to tell her it's never going to be anything real. They laughed softly, as if pity excused the cruelty. And I thought, is this what invisibility feels like? Not just being unseen, but being seen wrong? But fate has a taste for timing. At table 6, Robert Anderson, the man they all wanted to impress, was beginning to connect the dots. He had heard of DT Enterprises. He had signed memos about its acquisitions. He had seen the name D. Thompson in bold letters on contracts. And in a few minutes, he was going to look me in the eye and realize that the mother of the bride, mocked for her late-life crisis, was the very person who now owned his company. The laughter would stop. The silence would begin. And I, who had chosen invisibility, would be dragged into the light. The ballroom was still pulsing with chatter when Robert Anderson finally rose from his seat at table 6. He adjusted his jacket, still pale from our conversation, and walked toward me with the stiff gait of a man carrying a secret too heavy to keep. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, polite but urgent. I corrected him softly. "It's Miss Thompson?" His eyes darted as if recalibrating. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Robert Anderson, COO at Sterling Tech." The words landed like a quiet drumbeat. Sterling Tech. The very company my team had closed on 3 months earlier. I had signed the acquisition papers myself in an office that smelled of stale coffee and new leather, watching as the future of hundreds of employees transferred into my stewardship. Now, here was its executive, shaking my hand at my daughter's wedding, believing I was a hobbyist with delusions of grandeur. "I know who you are," I said evenly. He smiled politely, still unaware of the chasm opening beneath his feet. "Your daughter mentioned you were in consulting." "What sort of work do you do?" I let the pause linger long enough to taste. "Acquisitions, operational consulting, growth strategies." He nodded, expecting small potatoes. "Mostly local shops, I imagine." I tilted my head. "Actually, mid-sized firms in the tech sector. Companies on the brink of scaling." That's when his brows arched. Curiosity cracked his mask. "Really? Have you worked with any names I'd know?" I considered him for a beat, then decided I was done hiding. "Yes, Sterling Technologies." The champagne nearly slipped from his hand. His face drained of color as if someone had pulled the plug. "Sterling was acquired by DT Enterprises." His voice had gone low, reverent. He studied me with dawning realization. "You're not saying—" "I'm D. Thompson," I said quietly. It was as though the air thinned around us. The weight of silence pressed into his shoulders, into mine. "You're the D. Thompson," he whispered. "You own Sterling." I nodded once. No theatrics, no bravado, just fact. He ran a hand through his hair, panic flaring behind his eyes. "Good God. Do you realize half the people in this room are employed by companies in your portfolio? They've been mocking you all night, mocking their own boss." His voice cracked with disbelief. "Mr. Anderson," I murmured, "please, this is my daughter's wedding. I don't want a scene." But integrity sometimes trumps discretion. His jaw clenched, his face taut with indignation. "With respect, Miss Thompson, this isn't just about you. This is about respect for leadership, for women, for truth. People need to know who they've been ridiculing." And before I could stop him, he was striding toward the microphone. The music stuttered to silence as he tapped the mic. 200 faces turned, wine glasses paused midair. Ladies and gentlemen, Anderson's voice rang. I apologize for interrupting, but I have to correct a grave misunderstanding. My stomach dropped. I wanted to vanish into the floor, but there was no stopping it now. We've all been laughing tonight, he continued, at stories about a woman chasing unrealistic dreams. We've dismissed her as dabbling, patronized her with pity. But what you don't know is that the bride's mother, Diana Thompson, is none other than D. Thompson, CEO of DT Enterprises, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in our industry. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone dropped a fork. Rachel made a choking sound that split the silence. In the last 18 months, he said, Miss Thompson has acquired 6 major companies, including Sterling Technologies, my company. She manages a portfolio worth over $50 million. His voice hardened. So when you laughed at her so-called midlife crisis, you were laughing at your own employer, at your leader. Chaos erupted. The Hendersons, who had snickered loudest during the speeches, blanched and clutched each other. The Patels looked stricken, recalling every smug remark they'd made. Jake froze mid-step, his face vacant, mouth ajar. Rachel? Rachel looked gutted, her eyes wide, disbelief smearing into horror. Anderson turned, microphone in hand. Miss Thompson, perhaps you'd like to say something? 200 pairs of eyes drilled into me. My hands trembled as I took the microphone, but when I spoke, my voice carried steady. Yes, I said. It's true. I am D. Thompson of DT Enterprises. A hush blanketed the room. I never corrected anyone tonight because my daughter asked me not to talk about my work. I didn't want to overshadow her wedding. I chose silence out of love. I looked at Rachel then, her face pale as porcelain. But love doesn't mean erasure, and it doesn't mean accepting cruelty disguised as humor. When you mocked my late-life crisis, you were mocking the livelihoods of over 400 employees across 6 companies. When you said dreams have expiration dates, you dismissed achievements already secured. My words landed like stones in water, each ripple widening into stillness. Jake stammered. I had no idea. I feel like such an idiot. I met his eyes. You assumed age meant incompetence. That assumption is worth rethinking. Then I turned back to Rachel, who now looked like a child seeing her mother for the first time. You told me not to embarrass you. Tonight, I've done nothing but endure humiliation to protect you. But the truth has a way of arriving, whether we invite it or not. The silence was profound. You could feel the architecture of the night shift, the chandeliers, the polished marble, the weight of money and expectation, all bending to accommodate a reality none of them had prepared for. I handed back the microphone. Now, I said gently, let's return to celebrating this couple. But nothing in that room would ever be the same again. That was my story, one of humiliation turned to vindication, and of a mother who refused to let age dictate her worth. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told your dreams had an expiration date, I hope my journey reminds you that silence can be powerful, but truth is stronger. Thank you for watching and sharing this moment with me. If stories of resilience, family, and second chances speak to your heart, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the next chapter we share together. Until then, I wish you health, strength, and the courage to never let anyone decide you're too old or too small to matter. Moté, at her daughter's wedding, under glittering chandeliers and before 200 guests, 60-year-old Diana Thompson became the punchline of the evening. Laughter filled the ballroom as the bride and her maid of honor mocked her so-called late-life crisis, turning Diana's determination into a public joke. What they didn't know was that behind her calm smile sat a secret powerful enough to silence the entire room. 2 years earlier, Diana's life had unraveled, divorced after decades of marriage, laid off from a company that deemed her replaceable, left to rebuild from the ground up. Society told her that dreams had an expiration date, especially for women her age. But Diana refused invisibility. With nothing but her decades of experience and an iron will, she founded DT Enterprises, a consulting and acquisitions firm. Quietly, methodically, she grew it into a $50 million portfolio, acquiring 6 companies, including Sterling Technologies, where her new son-in-law worked. Yet her family never believed in her. Rachel rolled her eyes, Jake patronized her with smug lectures, and relatives dismissed her efforts as a hobby. Even as Diana paid for half the wedding, she was asked to blend in and not embarrass the family with talk of her little projects. She kept her promise, enduring humiliation in silence. But fate shifted when Robert Anderson, Jake's boss, recognized the name D. Thompson and realized who was sitting quietly at table 6. His announcement shattered the ballroom. Diana was not a delusional dreamer. She was their employer, their leader, the woman who had built an empire while they laughed at her expense. In that moment, the ridicule turned to awe, and the daughter who mocked her mother's ambition faced the devastating truth. This is more than a story of public vindication. It is a testament to resilience, to second chances, and to the lesson that no one should underestimate a woman who decides she is done being underestimated.